Welcome to the Business Intelligence Portal Podcast. Join us as we discuss how BI and analytics professionals achieve proper governance and high user engagement with their BI. Throughout this series, we will share practical approaches and tools for successfully implementing a BI portal. Now, let's dive in.
Welcome back to the BI Portal Podcast, where we discussed all things related to BI portals. My name is Marius Moscovici, and I'm the founder of Metric Insights, a leading BI portal vendor. My co-host here is Mike Smitheman, who leads sales and marketing at Metric Insights.
Welcome, Marius. Good to be back.
It's great to do this together again. In our last episode, we talked about the process by which you go about getting buy-in into doing a portal initiative. Today, we're going to take the next step in the journey, where we're going to talk about the proof of concept or POC process that usually comes about before an organization implements a BI portal initiative. In our roles in Metric Insights, Mike and I are often involved in the POC process on the vendor side of the equation. But today, we're going to put on different hats. We're going to put ourselves in the shoes of the customer and really talk about, what that journey looks like and how, as a customer, you can make sure that you are successful and generate the expected outcome of that POC process. We're also going to talk about the pitfalls that many organizations encounter during the POC process that get them entangled. So, Mike, let's start the discussion by talking about why organizations do a POC.
Yeah, so I think there's really two scenarios that we see in the sales cycle, right? That I think is whether you look at it from our perspective or the customer's perspective, there's two reasons they're doing it. The first is, as we spoke about in the last episode, there's a defined business case. They've justified a project, there's initiative in place, and they're looking to really prove out that initiative. And the reason they're looking to prove it out is most BI portal projects are pretty far-reaching in terms of potentially hitting a lot of users in the organization, even if that's not from day one. We see most projects sort of enterprise-wide. And they're also touching a lot of technical systems, and they're pretty integrated technically into a customer's environment. So to have the confidence that you're picking the right project, the right product, you want to test that out effectively. And we see that in a lot of proof of concepts, and that's why we're doing it. The second scenario is where a particular person in an organization sees the value of a BI portal and they think it's a good idea, but they haven't necessarily been able to define a business case and get buy-in yet. And sometimes a proof of concept, putting something sort of demonstrable in place, can help drive that interest across the organization. And we see that one fairly regularly as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess I would also add maybe a few things to what you said. I think there's sometimes a blending of those two that you discussed, because in some cases I've seen organizations do POCs to kind of prime the pump on the technical aspect of things. You always need, as you said, those technical teams involved, where you need to be able to get approvals from the architecture team, from the security team. And it's much easier to first get them to take a look at those, at what this technology is going to be all about in the POC stage and weigh in. And then when you get to the implementation, then you've sort of greased the skids, so to speak, or you prime the pump, and you know that that's going to be successful. Also, in general, I think some organizations do POCs, even when they pretty much know they're going to proceed with the project, just to be able to just generate momentum internally. They got people agreeing, but let's get people excited about it by giving them a little bit of a teaser into what they're going to look at.
Yeah, and I think we see that as well, right? The POC is sort of a kickstart for an implementation, which obviously benefits me as a customer if I can do that, because as you say, it sort of gets things going and gets momentum pre-purchase.
Yeah, and we should, just for the benefit of the listeners, we should make a distinction here between two terms that sometimes get used interchangeably, but we should define a little differently. There is the POC, the proof of concept, technical feasibility, evaluation of functionality, things that validate whether the product can do what you need it to do, as you said, Mike. But then there's something called a pilot. And that's very different from a POC, and that involves customers coming in and trying to get that first use case off the ground, maybe some very limited version of the overall end use case to generate value. And here we're really talking about that proof of concept stage, not the pilot stage so much.
Yeah, I think that's right. Terminology is different everywhere, but I think we'll get into sort of what constitutes a POC in a minute. But yeah, we should be clear about that.
Okay, so we know why organizations do POCs. Now, what generally defines success for a POC?
Yeah, so again, I think there's typically two things that we see, and I think you touched on this in sort of the opening discussion. There is the technical proof points, right? So we're going into an organization, as I said up front, it's typically an enterprise-wide deployment, and it's touching a lot of systems and technology, the security initiatives that we need to adhere to. So proving out technically that the solution is A, going to do what it says it does, but B, is going to do that successfully in your environment, and the uniqueness of your environment is a key sort of proof point that you need to put in place. So everyone is typically trying to prove out that technical viability in their organization. But then the second piece is the business buy-in. Mm-hmm. So we spoke a lot in the last podcast about sort of the jaded customers, the customers being your end users when it comes to BI. And so getting good sponsors on board who buy into the process, doing that as part of the proof of concept, obviously helps with justification of the project, also helps with the momentum that you spoke about earlier. So typically, what defines success? It's a technical set of checkpoints, and it's also some business checkpoints for the end users, the end user buy-in to say, yeah, this is something that is going to make a difference this time to BI consumption in the organization.
How much for these type of initiatives, Mike, how much do you think is business versus technical for most organizations? Is it 50-50? Is it a different kind of distribution? What have you seen?
I think, again, it comes down to the first discussion we had in the last episode. Is there an initiative in place? Everyone's bought into the concept of a portal. They know ultimately what they're trying to achieve with a portal initiative. The budget's there, all of those things, it's out there and defined. In that scenario, a lot of times it's really just the technical aspects that you're checking off. If I know what I'm trying to achieve, it's very easy to go in and say, is this product going to check all those boxes? I would say they're few and far between in the proof of concepts that we see. And it's probably, I'm picking numbers out of the air, it's probably more 50-50, where we go in initially, we prove we can connect, we prove we're going to fit in with the security requirements of that organization. And then we build out, again, not a production system necessarily, but some proof points that will get end users excited, that drive towards a business use case and get them bought into it.
Yeah, I think, when you boil it down, what you described is sort of, if you're thinking about the POC and you're thinking about, well, what do I want to put in it? You can almost reverse engineer that by sort of asking the question, well, hang on, if I get this to the finish line, if we're done with the POC and I'm looking back, who are all the people that might raise their hand and say, no, wait, you haven't proven this. You haven't vetted that this is going to be consistent with our security, or you haven't really shown that this can solve this critical problem that we've identified. But who are all those people? What are the kinds of things that they might say? And then you want to be thinking about the POC in a way as to how can I set it up so that success means that all of those key questions have been answered.
Absolutely. And I think, as we said in the first podcast, that one of the goals of this series was to give some tools and templates for working through this stuff. Something that we'll share in the speaker notes, and that some of you will see on the screen if you're watching the video version of this, is sort of a buyer's guide to a BI portal, and we've outline some of the key functional areas that you should be thinking of. And not everything might be relevant to everyone, but thinking about your business use cases and your technical points that you're trying to achieve, making sure you have those well documented going into the POC, so that coming out of it, you can say whether you've met that success criteria or not. And so this spreadsheet that you're looking at here, or that you can download, sort of outlines all of the possible things that you might want to think about when you're going through the POC process. And you should pick and choose what's relevant to your organization.
Yeah, I think what Mike says is, what you say is exactly right. And I'd encourage you, when you look at that resource, obviously it's not a one size fits all for any organization. There may be criteria on there that you feel like don't care about, you want to strike. There may be some things that you want to add, but one of the key, if you think about that success of the POC, meaning that you've really proven out all the things that might trip you up, that they're not going to happen down the line. Well, you need to know what those things are that are going to trip you up. And so, that being the case, as somebody new to the BI portal space, you may not think of things. You may not be, there might be 5 things you think of, but there are 6, 7, and 8 pieces of key functionality that you actually need and you haven't considered. But once you think about them, you realize, oh, without this capability, this is actually not going to be a success. So what do you think about the right process to kind of make sure all those gotchas are kind of brought up into the open and bubbled up?
Well, I think that's also a reason for doing the POC, right? Because I think, you don't necessarily know everything going into the POC. You've got a good idea if you haven't implemented a BI portal previously in another company or anything, and this is your first journey. The POC is a great sort of starting point to put in place or prove out the things that you want. But in doing that, it should bubble up other things as well, right, that maybe you haven't thought of. So, using it as a learning process as well, I think is all right. And, being realistic about what you can prove out in that time frame as well. But so I think, thinking through the criteria as it relates to your business, but then having an open mind as you go through the process to say, okay, there might be some things that I haven't thought about. And honestly, from the customer perspective, leaning on vendors as well, who are doing this day in and day out with other companies who should be able to give guidance around what you should be thinking about as well.
Yeah, maybe get the success criteria that all your vendors would recommend and fuse them together into some kind of master list based on what you think is reasonable and necessary, and what you feel is extraneous, to take out.
I think as well, being realistic about everyone has sort of their wish list of everything, and it's always everything, but then bubbling that back or boiling that back to what is critical for what you're trying to solve. If you're asking for a bit of functionality, is that really something that's going to, affect the business? Is it nice to have versus a critical thing? Have your wish list, but then tie it back to, okay, what are the critical versus nice to have sort of things on there?
So, Mike, we've talked about sort of what should be in the POC in general, how to try to be successful about it. Who are the key players? Who are the key stakeholders you think that need to be involved in this?
So again, there's a theme here in terms of there's your technical team. So usually who we're interacting with in a sales cycle is let's call it the business intelligence team. They're the people who are creating content and who want this portal to get content out to users. That's typically who we're engaging with initially on these sort of initiatives. So obviously they're going to be involved, and they're typically the sponsors of the process. But there is a wider, again, because it's a enterprise initiative in a lot of cases, there's a wider IT community, if you like, that's going to be interested, whether that's infrastructure, you've got to push this out somewhere and host it somewhere, and having the teams responsible for provisioning hardware, whether that's in the cloud or on premise, they're going to get involved. Security. Every company of size has their security policies and processes that you need to adhere to. So understanding that you check those boxes when you go through it. And then the people responsible for the technologies that you're going to connect to on the technical side. So, if we're putting a portal in place to connect to Tableau and Power BI and SharePoint, who owns those systems, who has the necessary credentials to be able to connect to those systems. So there's an ecosystem of technology people that it's critical to get on board early, so that when you deploy the POC, you can actually connect and check those initial technical boxes. So technology folks, then the business users. So we spoke about the second half being people who are actually going to use the software and get excited about it and engage with the portal and benefit from the portal more than anyone else. So getting a key group of user sponsors on board who are excited and want to help out. And I'm sure you see this with implementations too, right? Getting that initial group of people who are going to shout from the rooftops about how they like the project is key if you can get them in the POC as well. And then finally, obviously, the sponsors, whether that's the exec sponsors, whoever is ultimately going to give the say on yes or no. I'm talking again about sort of the POCs that are proving out for an initiative that's in place already, who's responsible for that initiative, making them aware of what's going on. If you can get them involved in the actual evaluation process, having them involved in the process helps as you get through to the end of it.
What do you think about, I know this comes up a lot for people as they're thinking through the process. What do you think about the legal and contract side of things, the procurement team? Do you find that it's better to get them involved from the beginning and at every step of the process, or is it better to just run the POC process, so with users, with the technical team, and then once that's played out, then bring them in? What do you recommend?
I think so. With my vendor hat on, I would say get them in early, right? But I think the reality is that your organization is going to have a process for purchasing software, whether that's the POC process, the legal process, the procurement process. There's going to be a process there. And rather than saying, okay, when should I bring in legal or procurement, I think it's more a case of just understanding the process in your environment. Because if I put my vendor hat on, all a vendor is looking for is transparency. They're putting time and effort into supporting you through the process, and they just want to know what that process is and when they can expect to do things. Now, in an ideal world, we're all looking for success in the process and the project. Yeah, if we can get them on earlier and get them going through, make sure there's no showstoppers when we get to that point, the earlier we know that, the more effectively you can sort them out. But I would say it's more about knowing the process that you have internally. If you haven't bought software before in your organization, understanding what's involved in that, and then just communicating that and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah. So basically everyone knowing, making sure that you don't get to the end and find out that some critical requirement that somebody
Correct.
has not been evaluated.
Yeah, there's some piece of paperwork that needed to be filled in, or some security audit that didn't happen that is part of a procurement process that you haven't thought of, those sort of things.
Okay. So you have this set of criteria that you've come up with. You've identified the key stakeholders. What have you seen from a best practices perspective be the best way to actually engage with those stakeholders to get the feedback you need to validate the POCF?
So again, we spoke about the criteria up front, which may change throughout the process as you learn more. But having, as you're going through the creation of the POC, the creation of the use cases, making sure you document those in terms of what you're trying to achieve is sort of the first step. So that when you then roll it out to your end users, and I'm talking now about the business part of it, when you roll it out to your end users, again, this is a proof of concept. You're not rolling out a production system. So you want to be setting the expectations around the criteria that you were trying to achieve in the POC so that they can give feedback on that. Whether it's surveys, whether it's having sort of roundtable type meetings where they can give their feedback in real time, having a period where they're looking at the product with the lens of what that criteria was can get you some meaningful feedback, and then take suggestions as well by all means. So having that as sort of a feedback from the business perspective. On the technical side, I think it's actually a little bit easier. You've got a bunch of boxes that you need to check. Did you check them or not? Right. But just understanding what's absolutely required, what might be a nice to have, what's something that we might be able to do in the future on the technical side. I think just having that perspective is important.
So you have that criteria based on each individual, who they're, if it's a technical criteria, have we met all of your connectivity needs? Does it look like it's working functionally? Does it performing properly for you on the less tangible aspect? Does it look like it has the usability you're expecting, and so on and so forth? That's more the business criteria. But you've got the criteria by persona, and then there's some mechanism by which they can funnel back information about that, as well as the overall assessment of what.
And that's an interesting point that I've just thought of as you were saying that. So we think a lot about functionality. We think a lot about the business use cases. Oftentimes, people aren't buying a portal to roll out to 100,000 people in the organization on week one. It's typically a journey that they take. And so it may be stating the obvious, but thinking about the end game as well when you're going through that evaluation. You don't want to evaluate the software for the first couple of teams where there's a few thousand people and all looks great, and then you try to roll it out to 100,000 and suddenly it collapses. So thinking about scalability and the end game is important when you're setting that criteria as well.
Yeah, so performance is that's a great point, because that's the worst possible thing to have, is to run a POC, find out that then at the end of that you miss some of the key success criteria, and you've gone the wrong route, and then you have to start again, and you're starting again from a terrible place because you've lost a lot of credibility with the people that you're trying to run.
You will probably not get to start again in that scenario.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. So Mike, let's say you've got all that in place, and now you're ready to start your evaluation, and you've got a number of vendors coming in, lots of vendors in the BI portal space. How do you go about working through that process with multiple vendors? What have you seen sort of best practices around that?
So I think you can narrow it down fairly significantly before you actually get into the POC process. So you shouldn't just jump into that POC process. You should take the time to meet with vendors, take the time to understand their software through demos or discussions with their technical team or whatever it might be. So based on your understanding of what you're trying to achieve and the scale of that and the scope of that, you should be able to narrow it down to a defined set of vendors who potentially can meet that criteria, because it's not going to be everyone. And I would factor in the build versus buy to that as well. So one scenario is you could go and build this yourself internally with your own technology. So almost understanding whether that is a viable path, and we can talk more about that in a minute, but narrow it down to at least, at most a couple of vendors who you think can fulfill the criteria that you have. And again, I wouldn't underestimate the effort it involves to go through a proof of concept with any vendor. It's probably slightly easier the second time because you've learned who the stakeholders are in the company and who you have to talk to get connections to certain systems or technologies. But you're going to have, if you're going to bring the software in for a proof of concept, you're going to have to go through the security reviews for each bit of software. You're going to have to go through the connections for each bit of software. So don't underestimate the effort of doing that alongside just implementing the business use cases as well. So narrow it down as much as possible, be realistic. If you really think there's more than one vendor who could fulfill it and you need to do proof of concepts with them, set the appropriate expectation internally, understand that people are going to have to put time into that evaluation each time from your side, whether it's the business or the technical folks, and try and keep it as streamlined as possible. The last thing you want to do is spend 6-12 months doing POCs when initiatives change, budgets go. You want to strike while the iron's hot to get something out there.
Yeah, so that's great. So basically you're saying kind of go broad initially, survey the market, understand what's there, qualify in a very small number of vendors that you feel represent the best possible fit for your overall high level needs, and then go deep with them. Right. And that way that's kind of the balancing act that you've got to do in order to make it work.
Correct.
That makes a lot of sense. So you talked about build versus buy a little bit. You alluded to that. Let's talk about that, because that's often comes up, right? There might be, I know I've been in to organizations where they maybe already have a portal that's built, maybe multiple portals. They've been custom built internally by their IT group or some development team. And they're thinking, oh, well, do we just take that as a starting point and build it out into the solution we need, or do we go and buy something commercially available off the shelf? So how do you factor that into a good POC criteria and make that decision?
Well, it's interesting because your perspective on this is probably the right place to start. So when you go into an organization where we're potentially replacing an in-house build, I guess, what do you see? Why are they doing that, right? Because really what you need to think about in the POC, if you're thinking about building, you want to make sure you've got all your bases covered, right? And what are the things that are going to trip you up in the future when you roll this out? So what do you see? Why are people replacing their in-house builds?
So usually what I've seen, the way the in-house builds work is that there's some group of engineers, usually a small group, and they get very excited about putting together a portal. They see the need for it, and they're technically capable, and they've got an idea of what they're going to put together, and they craft a solution, and that becomes a starting point. And then management has to figure out, well, the consideration, usually the calculus usually goes something like this. Well, if we can continue building in-house, now that obviously requires a ongoing commitment, because you're not going to want to build a solution that is with a set of developers and then let those developers go do something else. So do I have an ongoing commitment to do that? And in doing so, then I can completely customize that solution to be 100% what I want, as I can control every feature down to the last little detail. Or do I take something off the shelf where I don't need a development team? Then I have to obviously let go and consider sunk cost, what I've already done, which is sometimes a little bit difficult. I reallocate those engineers to do something else, and then work with that vendor to be able to mold that solution into what I need, whether it be through customizations available in that technology, getting on that vendor's roadmap, because it's never 100% exactly what I want. I'm not saying never, but in many cases it's not. So that's really what I see is most of the time.
So is it a sort of maintainability? Like, are they going to a vendor because in a lot of times it's become sort of too difficult to maintain and evolve and too costly to do that internally? Or?
Usually what happens is there was a significant underestimation of the complexity of work required first to really get to 100% features set required, not even everything on the wish list, but what is it that's really required to make your users happy. So that was not understood well enough going into the project, when they realized it's a little bit bigger than they thought, and now they're going out to look for this. And then also the other thing that happens is there's the realization that, hey, hold on a minute, there is going to be ongoing commitment required here, because if I've integrated with Tableau API and the Power BI API, well, now I've got to really keep track of those APIs, and when something changes, I've got to change it. Oh, I have to have an operational team where if there's some kind of a bug, I can quickly jump in and fix that. I need to QA this increasingly larger, more complex software that I've deployed. So a lot of those factors oftentimes drive people to think and consider whether they do it, whether they are going to do anything
I guess
else.
bringing on new technologies as well, right?
Yeah,
I think
exactly. It's not. I started thinking about just Power BI, but now I realize I've got like a number of other tools I need to put in place. Oh, what about the security model? The simple security model I had in mind now doesn't really hold up to the needs I have with discoverability and access requests and all these things that are required. So I think that a lot of times drives the need, because we, as you know, Mike, we oftentimes come in where there is already a built solution, and we do that. And so fundamentally, I kind of come to loop back to the base question. I think you really need to understand how sophisticated of a solution you need, right? And make sure that when you look at the buy versus build, if that's part of your POC effort, then really assess whether, number one, does the team you have in place, is it sufficiently sized with sufficient skills to be able to execute on all of the criteria that's needed within a reasonable period of time? And number two, do you have the long-term commitment to keep that team engaged over the coming years as you need to maintain in production? As people roll off of that, will you be able to find other people in the organization or hire into those roles, right? So do you have a commitment from management to do that? And then those two things together will determine whether the build option really is something that should stay on the table, or whether it's something that should be removed.
I think it's an interesting thing we see a lot pre and post sale, right? On the face of it, the idea of a BI catalog or a BI portal seems pretty straightforward, right? I'm just going to go and connect to all my systems. I'm going to have a process where I can pull in content and make it available to someone, right? But the devil is in the detail of things like security, of things like changing interfaces to these systems, of things like that. Seems easy if I'm doing it for 100 reports and 100 users, but now I have tens of thousands of reports and potentially hundreds of thousands of users. The complexity of these things is where the difficulty comes in, and the scale of these things is where the difficulty comes in. So back to the question, I think you're right. That's what you've got to think about, is think deeply into what it is you're trying to achieve, and potentially what that might look like in 12, 24 months, 3 years out. And are you really set up to manage?
So, Mike, what do you think are good practices around setting of timelines for the POC?
Yes, I think there's timeline, and then there's when do you start the POC, and we've kind of touched on both of these a little bit in this discussion already. So it would be very easy to jump into a POC after that first demo that you've had with a vendor because it looks interesting, right? Let's try it out. Again, understanding why you're doing a POC in the first place is important. Is it to drive interest? Is it to fulfill an initiative that's out there already? And make sure you've got all your bases covered before you jump into it, because it's going to tie in a lot of people, as we've spoken about, and take a fair amount of effort to do. So making sure the time is right, making sure there's no gotchas down the line, and if it's successful, it's something you can move forward with, I think is the first thing. So that's sort of when do you do it. How long do you do it? I think remembering it is a proof of concept. So we're not trying to implement a production system. We're not trying to implement even a pilot here. We're just trying to say, okay, for the business use cases we've put in place, will this particular technology solve that and deliver what we're trying to do? So typically what we see is 1 to 2 months as a start to end process is makes sense. And that's not all about delivering the business case. It's about going through the necessary security checks so we can install the software and make the connections with the necessary accounts and permissions. So there's the deployment and the installation of the software and testing it technically for scalability or whatever it is you've decided you need to do. Then it's the development of the use cases that we spoke about, and then it's the acceptance criteria, the acceptance period where users are coming in and looking at it and giving you feedback on how it is. So it's a little bit of how long's a bit of string, but I think if you're going longer than a couple of months, it becomes a drawn out process. People get frustrated that they're having to put time into it. It runs the risk of sort of petering out and not going anywhere if you don't keep that momentum going. And I think that's key when you're going into it, as we've said so far, is don't underestimate the effort involved in it, so that everyone is sort of excited and has the right perspective on it.
Yeah, I think the way it's exactly what you said, and I mean the way I think of it is, think about all the things that you need to do from a validation perspective. Spinning up an environment, testing it, getting feedback on various criteria, getting people to review and then get back to you, and then the best way to do it is to think about in your organization, because if your organization is a little bit different, what's the minimum amount of time for each of those pieces that is required in order to be able to get it done. And set the POC timeline by adding up all those minimums and putting dependencies together and generating your project plan. And the reason it's important to set it at the minimum is that you can very easily lose momentum. And if they have long, as you said, if it's a drawn out process, if I have 2 weeks to get back to you, well, I'm going to do a bunch of other things. And by the time I have to get back to you, I've forgotten what my feedback was. And so not only does having too long of a window have a chance, have the risk of failure because you don't get there, but you have lower quality feedback that comes in because you can only keep people focused on any kind of POC initiative with so much time, and so compressing it into a shorter window usually is much more.
Agreed. So I guess that sort of ties into the next bit of the discussion is potential pitfalls in this process. So I guess time is one. Letting it go too long or having the wrong expectations about how long it's gonna run. What else have we seen out there?
I think that one of the key issues that I've seen is sometimes a lack of understanding as to what is going to be required to really get approval. Right. So then this happens a lot for folks that are running the POC for the first time or in a different part of our organization or for a purchase amount that is a little bit beyond what they purchased before. They don't necessarily recognize what the exit criteria is going to be, not in terms of the evaluation, but, okay, we're going to do the evaluation. We're going to generate the report. Who needs to see it? Have we factored everybody's feedback into the criteria up front, right? So that when we get to the end, we don't realize, well, yeah, it meets all this criteria, but there's actually another 3 criteria that we haven't even evaluated that's important to the key project sponsor or one of the key people that has to sign off on this. So that in my mind is a key gotcha. You just anticipate the points of failure, right? Ask yourself, imagine that you've completed who the whole process, who will be able to stand in your way and say, no, even though all this criteria is passed, we're not moving forward. Why will they say that? And then figure out up front with those individuals or those executives, what's the key criteria that's going to ensure that that's going to be successful.
Yeah, as I think about pitfalls, I think we've really talked about them all in some respects, right? Doing the POC at the right time, making sure you've got both the technical and the business side covered and not just tackling one or the other. I've seen that a lot, people just falling into checking the technical boxes, but then when they take it for approval, well, what's the business case for doing this? And we haven't thought about that. So all the things that we've spoken about, making sure you've evaluated all the options. It's easy to get excited about something, a particular product or a particular vendor seems good. You take it for approval. Well, what would it cost us to just build this internally? If you don't have that answer and have justification, it's going to come back and bite you and stall the process. I mean, you have to go back.
Or if you haven't done your research up front and the executive says, well, what about vendor X?
Right.
Did you look at them? And you have to say, well, no, I only looked at vendor Y. Well, that's going to be a big problem. They're going to have a lack of doubt in your due diligence that you
right. So thanks, Marius. Interesting discussion. So we've gone from business cases to proof of concepts. As we go into the next episode, I think we're going to talk more about the implementation process, which I think is going to lean a lot on what we've discussed today as well in terms of pitfalls and how you should go about it. But thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Marius, and look forward to talking to you in the next episode.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks everyone for joining.